My father's double life, a hidden family, and the letter that changed everything. It was a rainy afternoon when I first found it. A letter, hidden in the attic, yellowed with age but unmistakably addressed to my late mother. To my dearest Sarah, it began, in handwriting that looked eerily familiar. My father's handwriting. The attic had always been a treasure trove of forgotten memories, but this letter was no nostalgic artifact. It was a bombshell waiting to explode. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, the ink slightly smudged but still legible. Each word pulled me into a reality I wasn't prepared to face. "I love you, but I can't stay," the letter read. "I have obligations that you and Michael can never know about. Please understand, it's for the best. Michael, that's me. My father left when I was 6, and my mother had always painted his departure as a tragic tale of a man overwhelmed by life's pressures. She never spoke ill of him, and I grew up clinging to the idea that he had loved us, that circumstances beyond his control had pulled him away. But this letter hinted at something else entirely. I read it again, this time catching phrases that made my stomach churn. A family that needs me, promises I must keep, a life I can't escape. A family? Another family? Questions swirled in my mind like the storm clouds gathering outside. I confronted my mother's memory first, as if she could somehow hear me from the beyond. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered to the empty room. "Why did you let me believe he was a good man?" Unable to sit with the unease, I took the letter to my uncle, my mother's brother. He had always been a steady presence in my life, the one who stepped in when my father stepped out. When I showed him the letter, his face darkened. He sighed heavily and motioned for me to sit. "Michael," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "Your mother wanted to protect you. She didn't want you to grow up resenting him, even though he deserved it. The truth is, your father had another family." The words hit me like a freight train. "Another family? While he was with us?" My voice cracked with a mix of anger and disbelief. My uncle nodded. "He was living a double life. 2 wives, 2 sets of kids, 2 homes. Your mother found out shortly before he left. She confronted him, but he chose them over you. She didn't want you to carry that weight." I felt the air leave my lungs. My entire childhood, my identity, everything I thought I knew about my father was a lie. "Do they know about me?" I asked. "I don't think so," my uncle replied. "Your mother made sure you were kept out of their world. She didn't want you to be a secret or an afterthought." That night, I couldn't sleep. I Googled his name, something I hadn't done in years. There he was, smiling in photos with his other family, a woman who wasn't my mother, children who weren't me. They looked happy, like the family we never got to be. I debated for days whether to reach out. Part of me wanted answers, closure, a confrontation. Another part feared what I might find. Would they welcome me or see me as a threat to their perfect life? Did they even know I existed? Finally, I decided to write my own letter. "Dear Dad," it began, though the word felt foreign now. I poured my heart onto the page, my pain, my questions, my anger. I didn't know if I'd ever send it, but writing it was the only way I could make sense of the storm inside me. Weeks passed before I mustered the courage to send it. I mailed it to the address I found online, half hoping it would get lost on the way. But 2 weeks later, a response arrived. It wasn't from him, it was from his other wife. "Michael," the letter began, "I'm so sorry you've had to carry this burden. I didn't know about you or your mother until recently. My husband never told us. I can't imagine the pain you must feel, but I hope we can find a way to talk." She included her phone number. I stared at it for hours, torn between the desire to call and the urge to burn the letter. In the end, I dialed, my heart pounding with every ring. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, tentative. "This is Michael," I said, my voice trembling. "I think we need to talk." The conversation was awkward at first, but eventually the walls began to crumble. She told me about their life, how my father had always seemed distant, how he traveled often and kept parts of his life hidden. She cried when I told her about my mother, about the years we spent waiting for him to come back. In the end, I didn't find closure, but I found pieces of the truth. My father was a flawed man who made unforgivable choices, but I refused to let his actions define me. I decided to focus on the family I had, the mother who loved me unconditionally, the uncle who stepped up, and the memories of a childhood built on her strength. As for my father, I realized some questions would never have answers. But that's okay. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go of the past, even when it feels impossible. The unbreakable bond, how my brother's betrayal exposed a family's dark secret. I've always thought of myself as a straightforward guy. My life was an open book. Decent job, good friends, and a fiancé I couldn't wait to marry. We were just 3 months away from the wedding when everything crumbled. It started with a message, just a notification on my phone. But it flipped my world upside down. The sender was a name I hadn't seen in years. Sarah, my ex-girlfriend. The one who disappeared after college, leaving nothing but a void I spent years filling. Her message was simple. Can we talk? It's important. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should reply. After all, I was engaged to Emily, the love of my life. But curiosity got the better of me. I typed back, "What is this about?" Her response was immediate. "I think you deserve to know something before your wedding. Please meet me." Emily was sitting across the room, scrolling through her phone. Her laugh, her smile, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, all reminded me why I'd asked her to marry me. But the message lingered in my mind. What could Sarah possibly need to tell me now, after all this time? Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her the next day. We met at a small coffee shop across town. Sarah looked almost the same as I remembered. Bright eyes, the same nervous energy. But there was a heaviness to her now, as if she carried a burden too big to bear. "Thanks for coming," she said, fidgeting with her cup. "Just tell me what this is about," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. "This," she said, sliding them across the table, "this is why I'm here." I glanced down. Medical records, DNA tests. My name was on them. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice rising. She swallowed hard. "I found out after we broke up that I was pregnant. I didn't know how to tell you, so I didn't. I moved away and tried to handle it alone. But Mark, you have a son. He's 6 now." The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. A son? 6 years old? My mind raced. How could she keep this from me? Why now? "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded, her eyes filled with tears. "Because you're getting married. You deserve to know before you start a new chapter of your life." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need time to think," I muttered and walked out without another word. When I got home, Emily immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" "Enamor," she asked, her concern genuine. I wanted to lie, to brush it off as nothing, but I couldn't. I told her everything. Her face went pale as I spoke, and when I finished, she just stared at me. "You have a son?" she whispered. "I didn't know," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I swear, Emily, I didn't know." She stood up and walked to the window, her back to me. "This changes everything, Mark, everything." "It doesn't have to," I pleaded. "I love you. I want to marry you. We can figure this out together." She turned to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How can I plan a future with you when you have a past you didn't even know about? I need time to think." She packed a bag and left that night. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus at work. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Emily, my parents, even Sarah. Everyone wanted answers I didn't have. Eventually, I met my son. His name was Liam, and he had my eyes. Meeting him was surreal. He was shy at first, hiding behind Sarah. But when he finally smiled at me, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just a complication in my life. He was my son, and he deserved to know his father. Emily came back a week later. We sat down and talked, really talked, for hours. I told her about meeting Liam, about how I wanted to be there for him. She told me about her fears, how this revelation had shaken her trust in me, even though she knew it wasn't my fault. "I love you, Mark," she said, "but I don't know if I can handle this. I don't know if I can handle being a stepmother to a child you didn't even know you had." Her words cut deep, but I understood. This was a lot to ask of anyone. In the end, Emily decided to postpone the wedding indefinitely. We're still together, trying to figure out what our future looks like. I'm building a relationship with Liam, slowly but surely. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Life doesn't always go as planned. Sometimes the past comes back to rewrite your future. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about facing the mess together, one day at a time. The letter that broke my family apart and brought it back together. I had always believed my father to be a man of unwavering principles. He worked hard, provided for our family, and always seemed to carry himself with an air of dignity. Growing up, he was my hero, the kind of man I aspired to be. But as I discovered not long ago, even heroes have shadows. It all started with a box, a weathered, dusty old box that my mom had pulled out of the attic during her spring cleaning frenzy. I remember her calling me over to help carry it down. She seemed hesitant, her hands lingering over the lid as though she was debating whether to open it or leave it locked in the past. "What's in it?" I asked, curious. She sighed deeply, her eyes clouded with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Your father's things, from before us." That sentence alone was enough to pique my interest. Before us? I couldn't recall a time my father had ever talked about his life before meeting my mom. It was as if his history began the day they met. I wanted to dig into the box right then and there, but my mom's hesitant expression held me back. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I snuck into the garage where I'd placed the box. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, and a few trinkets that seemed to hold sentimental value. It was the letters that caught my attention first. The handwriting was elegant, cursive, and distinctly not my father's. The letters were addressed to him, but signed by a woman named Elise. They were passionate, filled with longing and declarations of love. As I read through them, the timeline became clear. These letters were from just a few months before my parents had met. My heart raced as I realized what they implied. Elise and my father had been deeply in love, but for some reason, their story had ended abruptly. Among the letters, I found a photograph of a little boy with a date scrawled on the back. He couldn't have been older than 3 or 4. The resemblance to my father was uncanny. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes. My breath caught in my throat. Could this be my half-brother? The revelation sent me spiraling. Questions buzzed in my mind like angry bees. Who was Elise? What happened to her? And why had my father never told us about this child? I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. This wasn't just some long-forgotten chapter of his life. This was a secret that had been deliberately hidden. The next morning, I confronted my father. I laid the letters in the photograph on the kitchen table, my hands shaking with adrenaline. His face turned ashen as he saw them. He didn't deny it. Instead, he sat down heavily, rubbing his temples as though the weight of his secrets had finally crushed him. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "Elise was someone I loved deeply, and the boy in the picture is my son." His voice broke, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father cry. He told me everything, how he and Elise had planned a life together, how they had dreams of marriage and family. But life had a cruel way of intervening. Elise had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and she had pushed him away, not wanting him to suffer through her decline. By the time he learned of her passing, he discovered she'd given birth to his son, but her family had taken the boy and moved away, refusing to let him be a part of the child's life. I wanted to be angry, but seeing my father's pain made it impossible. He had lived with this grief, this loss for decades. Still, I couldn't ignore the hurt I felt. He had robbed me of knowing a sibling. He had kept this massive part of his life from us, from me. I demanded to know if he had ever tried to find his son, but he shook his head. "I didn't want to disrupt his life," he said. "What if he hated me for not being there?" That answer wasn't enough for me. I decided to take matters into my own hands. Using the photograph and the scant information I had, I began a search for my half-brother. It was painstaking and riddled with dead ends, but eventually I found him. His name was Daniel, and he was now in his mid-30s, living in another state with a family of his own. Reaching out to him was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. What if he didn't want to know us? What if he had no idea about my father? But the moment he saw the photograph I sent, he agreed to meet. It was surreal, sitting across from someone who shared my blood, but was a stranger in every other way. Daniel told me he had always wondered about his father, but had long given up hope of finding him. When I told him about our dad's reasons for staying away, he was quiet for a long time before finally nodding. "It's not what I would have wanted," he said, but I understand. Sakri. When I brought Daniel home to meet our father, it was like a weight had been lifted off all our shoulders. The reunion was tearful and filled with apologies and promises to never let the past divide us again. It didn't erase the years of separation, but it was a start. This experience has changed the way I see my father. He's not just the strong, stoic man I grew up idolizing. He's human, flawed, and capable of making mistakes. But he's also capable of love, of growth, and of healing. And for that, I'm grateful.